Mexico and Brazil are considered the leaders of Latin America, both with the strongest economies in the region. These countries were part of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and to get what they have been today, they took a long road, where it has been influenced by other superpowers. Both Mexico and Brazil share many structural characteristics. They have massive economies and populations, powerful budgets, and a huge working class, although they share some cycles of political development, such as the modernization process during the 20th century. Its trajectory to democracy has been different. Our conceptual framework for this report is the transition to democracy in both countries, focusing on the political trajectories. But it's important to describe the political system in order to understand it and thus compare it, which is why we will present first Brazil, followed by Mexico, in order to reach our comparative analysis results.
Brazil was a colony of Portugal for 3 centuries. In 1500, Brazil did not obtain its independence until 1822. This long colonial period was guided by repeat results led by many slaves brought from Africa. Later, the country became an empire, then a monarchy until 1889. The arrival of the Republic coincides with the rise of large landowners and with the continuation of European migration. After the dictatorship, populist regimes follow one another until the death in 1964 and the establishment of military regime for more than 20 years. It was until 1988 with the constitutional reform that opened the way of democracy. Brazil, a country almost as vast as the United States or China, has a population of 209 million people, especially on the southeast and northeast coast, with a megapolis of more than 10 million inhabitants such as Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. The population is very varied due to the multiple migration of people arrive from all European countries, but also from Asia to work in these immense territories. Originally occupied by Amerindians, which today now reach 300. In addition, there are close to 15 million Afro-Brazilians, distant descendants of slaves brought from Africa in the colonial period. Brazil is considered a representative democratic federal republic. As in most Latin American countries, it is a presidential regime, as well as the United States, where there is a marked division of powers. The federal republic is made up of 26 states and a federal district, Brasilia. However, with the state coup in 1964, a military regime was established for more than 20 years. It formally adopted nationalism, economic development, and anti-communism as official flag. They established a bipartite system, with the party subservient by the military and the parliamentary opposition, the Brazilian Democratic Movement. The president was not elected by popular vote, but by the National Congress. This system was fostered by a succession of political reforms that opened the door to multipartyism when the law and political parties was amended. It was so in 1983 that the demand extended by direct elections, directas ya, begins the collapsed military regime. With the new constitution of 1988, the new political regime managed to stabilize itself outside the route set by military, where the president is limited horizontally by the multipartyism and the institutionalization of the so-called coalition president, a system in which the president cannot have a majority of his party in the Senate or the Congress. It has to from coalitions and thus opened the doors to democratic regimes that has not yet ended. Brazilian society is dominated by the elites as a consequence of century-old pattern of socioeconomic inequality and the country's political heritage. Although there are general laws for all citizens, they are not equally enforced. Brazil also has a legacy of patrimonialism as a traditional system of domination of society by a strong state with a centralized bureaucracy. After the dictatorship, many Brazilians began to see their trust in states as crazy and instead saw civil society to lead the way towards change, an impulse that was very much shown in the 2013 step protest. During the military regime, an organization was created to oppose the authoritarian government, basic Catholic, women, Afro-descents, environmentalists, and neighborhood associations, that they contribute to democratization. The Brazilian women's movement became one of the most powerful in Latin America. They inject into the national political debate various issues that had previously been considered private: reproductive rights, violence against women and children. Under the military dictatorship, women's traditional orientations toward politics began to change. For the middle and upper classes, political opportunities follow education and occupational opportunities. At the time of the transition to democracy in early 1980s, there were more women than men enrolled in universities in Brazil. Cultural eradication of people of Africa descent dates back to the 1940s, but radical prejudice, disadvantage, and direct repression during the military regime led to the formation of new movements during the political opening. The Unified Black Movement was formed in 1978 to draw attention to racism and poor quality of life of the people of the American descent. In the early 1970s, the public generally accepted the role of the military in politics. In the late 1980s, Brazilians expressed a clear preference of democracy over dictatorship. People in general have become more skeptical of hierarchy, less tolerant to corruption, and more in favor of democracy. But this transformation is incomplete. The media and particularly the global network play an important role in programming successful presidential nominees. Politicals still use media empires in their home states to influence their current and local television and radio news, and Brazil is the second largest Facebook market in the world after the United States with 60 million users that plays an important role in galvanizing and coordinate the 2013 protests in hundreds of citizens across the country. Brazilian political life has long been animated by negotiation between the interests of landowners and those of military, while respect for democracy, law, and human rights was related to the background. This tradition of political agreement, which has its financial cost, was maintained in elections at all levels. This is where we expect corruption comes from. Transparency International statement that 58% of Brazilian deputies has been pursued for corruption. Public policies in Brazil are marked by the economy, social, and development. For example, public programs for the condition transfer of income to the poor sectors, such as Zero Hunters, focus on social security model, with the components of social security, health, and social signature. In the education policy, the idea of social development is compared to the idea of economic development. Brazil is one of the countries where there is more potential for education, and so the All for Education partnership have been created. The health system is made up of boarding public sector, which covers 70% of the population, and the private sector that covers 25%. Government institutions. Brazil, as we know, is a presidential regime that is divided by three powers: executive, legislative, and judicial. Like most countries in America, in the United States, for example, power is divided at the same levels as in Brazil. In the case of this country, the president's elections are different, as well as the powers in legislative and the election of the members of the judicial. Division of powers. Executive power. The executive with its powers clearly defined in the Constitution is headed by the President of the Eastern Republic, and its Vice President is elected for 4-year terms that it can be re-elected for the second time like in USA. Legislative power. The national legislature is constituted by the National Congress composed of two chambers, that deputies of lower house, 513 members, and federal senators, the upper house, 81 members. The number of members of the states and by the federal district in the chambers of deputies is proportional to the number of its population. In functions are provided and draft laws. Judicial power. The practice of justice are conferred on the Supreme Federal Court, the Superior Court, and Justice Regional and Specific Courts. Ministers, as well as all judges, are appointed for life. Brazilian electoral system is second round system. The president must win 50% in the first round, otherwise the most voted will be elected. The vote is compulsory and it has penalties. Single member for mayors and multi-members for councils. National Congress, Chamber of Deputies. 27 multi-members electoral districts are chosen from 8 to 70 seats in the relation to population, corresponding to 26 states of the country and the federal district. Senate, 27 multi-members elect districts corresponding to 26 states of the country and the federal district, where 3 members are elected for each one. Voting is mandatory from 18 to 70 years old, and there is penalization for no voting. It's a multi-partisan system. There are 4 main parties: Workers, the Brazilian Democratic Movement Party, the Brazilian Social Democratic Party, and the Democrats, but there are more than 30 parties that compete nationality. Government institutions are not the only ones, there are others. In the case of Brazil, we can say that it's a privileged place to enjoy freedom in each of these institutions. Governments like in China control almost all these institutions from family aspects, with the control birth for law for a single child, even social networks. Therefore, we can understand Brazil as a free institutional system and is private. Religion. Brazil is a country considered mostly as a Catholic religion, and is a country with the largest number of Catholics in the world. The church did not exert significant influence on education system. Religion was not a major factor in elections. Communities. Currently in Brazil, there are around 305 tribes for total about of 1 million people, equivalent to 0.4% of the Brazilian population. The government has recognized 609 territories for its indigenous inhabitants, which cover approximately 30% of the country's surface. Almost of these territorial reserves, 98.5% is located in the Amazonas. Media. The most important channel in Brazil is Rede Global. Has influenced society to the extent of influenced political decisions and electoral campaigns. Social media have also contributed a lot in the political sphere, influencing even much like the ones that 2013. Companies. The most common type of company in Brazil is limited liability company and has from the resemblance of the United States.
Mexico, as well as the most Latin American countries like Brazil, was conquered by the Europeans. Between 1519 and 1521, Hernán Cortés took over Mexico for 300 years. On September 16, 1810, Mexico proclaimed its independence from Spain. Mexico had several social and economic problems with their own and various presidents, like with Porfirio Díaz. These problems led to a revolution in 1910. In 1917, Mexico established a new constitution. In 1929, the PRI was established in the power, starting a dictatorship of one hegemonic party for 70 years. But it was until 2000 that the Partido Acción Nacional took power for 2 presidential terms. However, the PRI returned in 2012, but in 2018 elections, a new party, Morena, wins the majority for the first time in Congress. Mexico ranks over the 10th most populated country in the world. Their numbers of population is 126 million. Mexico's population is made of different ethnic groups, such as indigenous American Indians. A large majority of Mexicans are mestizos. They identify fully neither with any indigenous culture nor with the Spanish cultural heritage. Mexican people are very attached with their traditions, and also, thanks to the revolution, are very patriotic, and this has been reflected in politics. Republic, representative democratic, secular and federal, and elective democratic. It has 32 states. Mexico City is the capital and seat of the 3 government powers. It also has a presidential regime inspired by the United States system that is divided into 3 branches. However, like Brazil, Mexico lived a dictatorship with a facade of democracy by a hegemonic party for 71 years with the Institutional Revolutionary Party. It was from 2000 that the era of the PRI broke when the National Action Party came to power. Mexico always had a multi-party system, but due to corruption and electoral fraud, among other factors, kept the PRI in power. A unique feature of the transition or adaptation of the Mexican regime is that the Institutional Revolutionary Party never lost control over union corporate networks, whose origins date back to the post-revolutionary period, nor customer networks over important segments of the rural poor. Mexico, like other Latin American countries, remains a democracy in turn. Due to the legacy that was left in the pre-era, Mexicans are very supportive of the political institutions that emerged from the revolution, but this hegemonic party regime allowed confidence in the government to decline. Mexicans criticize government performance, especially in job creation, reducing social and economic inequality, fighting crime, and providing basic public services. Most government bureaucrats and politicians are viewed as distant, elitist, and selfish, if not corrupt. For the same reason that despite the fact that there were elections, the same party always won, Mexicans have been pessimistic about their ability to affect the results of the elections. The basic elements of this political culture remain in force, although today's Mexicans are much more aware of their ability to determine electoral results and are more demanding with electoral transparency. There are more informed Mexicans, are more likely to vote than less informed Mexicans. The interaction between the politician and society has been given through favors. The distribution of material benefits such as pantries is possibly more important than ever in shaping the electoral behavior of Mexicans. The purchase of votes, the use of the media, as well as the creation of social programs influenced the attitude of Mexicans towards the system. The Mexican society demanded a more transparent and competitive system. Mexican concept of democracy emphasized economic and social results rather than procedural freedoms, and the electoral strategies of all parties reflects this element of political culture. The Mexican political culture expresses above all a proud and mutilated people. It combines a culture of power, ideological sympathy, and formal tolerance, mix of concession and consumption, legality and sovereignty with structures of cheating, corruption, compromise, and repression, to which are added the old and new structures of marginalization, the old and new arts of information manipulation. The problem of corruption is the same, or worse still, it has increased. Nevertheless, the participation of citizens in public affairs has increased. Public policies in Mexico have mainly focused on economic and social development. Like Brazil, the problems of inequality, health, education, and security systems were mainly affected by corruption. Economic liberalization entered from the 80s, as in most of Latin America. However, poverty and insecurity began to increase, as well as immigration and organized crime. His public policies have always been reflected in social programs such as Oportunidades in each of the 90s. They are intended to achieve social equity. Mexico is among the 15 largest economies in the world and is the second largest economy in Latin America, and is highly dependent on the United States, which its economy policy has focused on the free trade agreement with North America and the exports of mineral and petroleum. Economic reforms are his priority, including reforms in legislation in the energy, finance, tax, and telecommunication sectors. Mexico is a presidential system inspired mostly by the USA system, where power is divided into three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial as well. In Mexico, most of the inputs to the legislature are given by direct vote. Division of powers. The executive power governs in accordance with the provisions of the legislation. Its holder constitutional president of the United Mexican States. For the execution of his tax, the president has the legal power to appoint his closest collaborators, who are the secretaries of state and the Attorney General of the Republic. The Federal Public Administration is in charge of the Secretaries of States and administrative departments. This has created that power is very centralized. The legislative power it is deposited in the Congress of the Union, which is divided into two chambers, one of deputies and the other of senators. Congress is in charge of issuing laws that regulate the international structure and operating of the Mexican Republic. The Chamber of Deputies made of 500 deputies. Of these, 300 are chosen by the principle of relative majority voting and 200 by the principle of proportional representation. Senate of the Republic. It is made of 128 senators, of which in each state and in the federal district. The judicial branch is in charge of monitoring compliance with the Constitution and the laws. It preserves that the Constitution is the supreme law and that there is no law or norm that contradicts it. The Supreme Court of Justice of the nation, which is the highest court in Mexico, also resolves disputes between the federation and the federal entity. In Mexico, the electoral system defines that the President of the Republic is elected by the principle of relative majority. Mexico has four principal political parties: Institutional Revolutionary Party, National Action Party, Democratic Revolution Party, and the National Regeneration Movement. Religion. The country is made up according to the Negi system that helps generate census in the country by 89% of Catholics and the other 21% of other religions. Influence this country in various ways, in political parties and in the approvals of laws such as the anti-abortion law, as well as in schools in everyday life of people. Communities. Mexico is a country with a great cultural and ethnic richness, having several dozen indigenous ethnic groups whose existence had not been recognized by the world of law until recently, so that consequently a policy had not been developed group of social rights as important as the rights of the indigenous peoples and communities. Media. 75% of the Mexican population learns of the main problems through television. This has led to making this medium the most important. The most viewed channel in country is Televisa. It has reached its power so much that through various spots it has caused changes in electoral campaigns. Although social media have also influenced political decisions making and how society views Mexico. Corporations. Most of the multinational corporations located in Mexico are American. Out of every 100 firms established in the country, 50 are from US. 33 come from other countries and 17 are Mexican. Historically, the country that has made the most direct investment in Mexico has been the United States, thanks to their closeness. Schools. In Mexico, public education is compulsory until high school. All the states have an autonomous higher education system, although unfortunately education has better quality in the private sector, which is inaccessible to many people.
Comparative political systems serve to explain events in each country and analyze certain processes. In the case of Mexico and Brazil, both countries are federations, and as in all of Latin America, they have presidential regimes. They are also one of the most unequal societies in the world, but the difference in democratization strategies are notable. The first is that the presidential coalition system is inherently unstable. Both countries are going through a deep political crisis coupled with very unfavorable economic conditions. While in Brazil the excess of counterweights to the presidency is an obstacle to governability in contrast to Mexico, where weak institutional counterweights and low political participation have accentuated the presidential crisis. In Brazil, the weakness of corporate controls over union was a decisive condition for the formation of a left-wing opposition coalition in the Brazilian democratic transition. In Mexico, the left-wing opposition found it difficult to form an opposition coalition due to the government control over the political activity of the unions. Second, in Brazil, the willingness to innovate the constitutional rules that improve citizen participation, both in the electoral sphere as well as the mechanisms of local democracy and direct democracy, contrasts with the inhibition of citizen participation in institutional design in Mexico. Even though they look some equal, their path to democracy has been challenging and unsustainable in a different way. But what they do agree on is that neither of their democracies has been fully consolidated, in large part due to the corruption experienced by both. There are several striking similarities between Brazil and Mexico when viewed in comparative perspective. Both are very large countries with the largest economies in Latin America. Their size has implications for the dimension of the domestic market and economies of scale. Both are middle-income countries, poorer in per capita terms in compared with superpowers, but much better than most African and Asian economies. And their economy depends on oil, among other natural resources. Both countries are also similar in having high population growth rates and long stories as independent nations. But an important factor here is that both live dictatorships but in different ways. On one hand, Brazil, with a military dictatorship established for 20 years, and on the other hand, Mexico, with a dictatorship with faked of democracy by a single hegemonic party, the PRI, for 70 years. What they have in common is that both dictatorships is that there was no political competition, and left a culture with non-conforming society, creating an active civil society in the 80s. In that decade, Mexico and Brazil undertook process of liberalization, alternation, and consolidation. of democratic systems, but the trajectories of each strategy have different routes chosen by interest of the political classes of both countries. His transition to democracy has had a different path with very similar effects. In both Brazil and Mexico, political elites have defined their routes and alternatives, articulating the appropriate coalitions to project their interest. In both countries, a presidential regime dominates, with considerable differences. In Brazil, the president has always depended, except in dictatorial periods, on partisan coalitions, while in Mexico, the regime has moved from an hegemonic party system to a multi-party system dominated by the PRI. But today, we see that Morena dominates the Congress. In Brazil, the political system has been through the presidential impeachment, the second in the contemporary democratic period, and in Mexico, presidentialism, although very strong in from the other powers of the federation, is notoriously ineffective in directing public policies of the state. Public policies and social programs to combat poverty are the main ones in both countries. They have been redistributive through the cash transaction and have also maintained a clientelistic pattern for years since their dictatorial regimes. The manipulation and the use of media are a platform for the rulers to persuade the electorate in both countries. But we can see nowadays a more active political culture to monitor the form of government and also to persuade people in social movements like feminists and the 2013 movement in Brazil through the social media like Twitter and Facebook. Another important contrast is the absence of strong corporate controls on unionism in Brazil, unlike in Mexico, where unions were controlled by the government. In the case of Brazil, they are necessary condition for the existence of a strong labor movement on which the Labour Party, PT, will emerge as an opponent. Corruption is a constant pattern in both states. However, considering that both countries have two of the most voracious and unpunished bureaucracies and political classes in the world, the reduction in Brazilian corruption is notable, probably due to an improvement in the judicial system. Although there is not a big difference, Brazil has an advantage in improving its anti-corruption instruments and probably the greater efficiency and impartiality of the system. According to the indicators used by the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International, in 2019, in a score of 100, Brazil has a 35 score, while Mexico went from a score of 29. The lower, the more corrupt. So Mexico is still more corrupt than Brazil. Even though both countries were colonies for the European empires that took with them the Catholic religion, the pattern of Catholicism remained more marked in Mexico in terms of its institution and politics, thus creating parties like the PAN. In Brazil, the Catholicism was key to the transition, persuading Catholics to manifest against the government. Both governments of Brazil and Mexico faced in the same period severe economic adjustment crises. The main one was that of external debt, by which international creditors obtained considerable power over the decisions of both states. Even though they applied neoliberal reforms, the economic strategies are in some way different. On one hand, Mexico has established an economic model oriented abroad, particularly towards the United States, from the structural reforms of openness to the exterior carried out in the early 90s of the last century with the NAFTA treaty, while Brazil adopted a model with a big articulation between the internal and external markets, diversification of external markets with a mix between exports, primary and industrial products, and a new state activism for development, which is part of the BRICS. The political context in which they took place could not be more different. Even facing the problems of state inefficiency and loss of autonomy, the solutions found in each country were oriented in opposite ways. On one run to multipartyism in Mexico, the adjustments had political cause to the PRI, opening the door to the right alternation, the PAN, and in Brazil to the left, PT, as opposition. The political participation in Brazil is bigger than in Mexico. Women have more voice. Thus, they have one of the largest feminist movements in Latin America. Also, voting is mandatory with penalties, while in Mexico is not penalized, and even Mexicans do not believe that their vote influences the electoral results due to the PRI regime that manipulated a large part of the elections in his era.